Welcome to the Property Pendulum, brought to you by Domain and Fear and Greed, the podcast that tells you which way the property market is going to swing and how to make the most of it. I'm Michael Thompson, and I'm joined by Alice Stolz, National Property Editor at Domain. And I've got to say, one of Australia's foremost experts on all things real estate, known to audiences around the country for her work on Nine, including The Block. Hello, Alice.
Hello, Michael.
Alice, we are setting ourselves a fairly lofty kind of goal today. We're going to answer the question, or we're going to attempt to answer the question, but let's be optimistic. Is now the time to buy? Because this week, the Domain house price report for the September quarter revealed that property prices are still breaking new records, but, and it's a significant but, isn't it? There are some promising signs for buyers. And we have a special guest joining us today to help us decipher all of this. Dr Nicola Powell is Domain's Chief of Research and Economics. Nicola, welcome to the Property Pendulum.
Hi, Michael.
Now, there's so much I want to talk to you about, but we only have a limited amount of time. But I want to talk about houses, about units, about prices, and about, importantly, how buyers can use this kind of information to get themselves the best deal. But let's start with houses, because it is really kind of the headline that grabs you every time this data and this report comes out. There's a number of cities that have hit new records in the last quarter, and it's led by Sydney. This is staggering, right? At $1.65 million, and that's the median price. That is huge, but it's not the only city that set a record, right?
It's not. And I do think, when you're looking at a 1.6 million median, it is eye-watering. And, it's unattainable for most Australians. Sydney has always been the most expensive capital. And I remember when Sydney broke that $1 million median house price. It was such a milestone. And I think what's interesting is we've got other cities that are going to break that milestone very soon. So Adelaide and Brisbane are on the way to breaking that $1 million median. But we have got prices rising. We've got house prices across the combined capitals are continuing to rise. But the key thing here is got to slow down in the pace of price growth. So what that means in layman's terms is prices are rising. They're just not rising as fast as they once were. And that is because there's a bit more choice on the market. But we do have, as you said, many cities at record highs. Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth have hit new record highs over the September quarter. So prices are still rising, and this is the interesting dynamic that we've got across Australia's housing market. We are stuck between a housing undersupply, a housing crisis, and a high cash rate. And there's an element of that high cash rate, I think, is containing borrowing capacity, and it's helping to slow down as well the pace of price growth as a result.
And so, Nicola, where are prices not rising and actually going backwards?
We do have a couple of cities that are in reverse. It is Melbourne and Canberra. House prices fell over the quarter. Melbourne has been a fascinating city to watch. Normally you see in a big city like Melbourne, you see prices are rising steeply or they're falling. And really what we've seen over the last couple of years is the city has pretty much done nothing in terms of its house price movement. They did fall over the quarter. It was down by 1.5%, but we've seen a little bit of volatility each quarter. I cannot stress how unusual that is to see a massive capital city like Melbourne go sideways for a long period of time. And I'm of the true belief that that city is continuing to build value. It's undervalued at the moment and it's underperformed compared to our other capital cities. Alice, I love a headline stat. Since March 2020, Melbourne house prices have only risen 12.5%. That is nothing compared to some of our bigger other capital cities like your Perth, your Adelaide, that have seen 70-80% increase over that period of time.
So it might be a case of the hare and the tortoise, though, mightn't it? Us sort of black turtleneck wearing Melburnians need not cry into our lattes too much. And it might be that we kind of crawl back a bit. Do you think so in the case of Melbourne?
Look, I think so. It's been interesting watching the change in buyer segments in Melbourne. Investors are definitely shying away and first-home buyers are taking their place. And that's probably a result of the land taxation changes. And we have got investors looking to other capitals where there's greater prospects for capital growth. And, first-home buyers are absolutely taken their spot in Melbourne. But I do wonder, the next price cycle that we see, Melbourne will likely overperform. It's still much more affordable compared to many other capitals. It's got a median of just over $1 million. Affordability is there. It's got the ability to urban sprawl, and that nature of urban sprawl has helped to contain overall Melbourne's house price. But I bet you, next price cycle, I've said it here, it will overperform.
Goodness me, we're getting some great tips here. Going to overperform, and I love that hot tip of Melbourne being undervalued right now. That is very exciting. Nicola, you mentioned some of the reasons why there's been this slowdown. And obviously Melbourne is one thing actually going backwards. Canberra as well, kind of going backwards now. But broadly, there has been this slowdown now in house price growth. Is it really just a matter of supply, greater supply, or is interest rates really starting to bite as well? The broader cost of living kind of crisis? Or is it just this big mix of factors all coming into play at the same time?
I think it is a bit of a mixture. Supply is definitely one of those key aspects. So over winter and into spring, we had a strong flow of new listings, and that wasn't met by the same amount of buyer demand. And what that's created is an increase in supply overall, what we call total stock, total choice on the market. So for any buyer out there, they will find that they have got more choice relative to what it was 12 months ago. It's slightly different depending upon the city. So for example, Adelaide, Perth and Brisbane aren't quite in that state. They're still deeply below the 5-year average for this time of year. But for example, Melbourne, overall supply is 30% higher than the 5-year average. In Sydney, 21% higher than the 5-year average. I know these are just numbers, but what it means is for a buyer, there is more choice. And what that does, and this is the sentiment side of our housing market, Alice, it changes perception, it takes away the urgency, it allows people to take a little bit more time on their decisions. And I think that's coming out in slower rates of price growth. We've got days on market is generally rising, discounting is also increasing. And so everything is pointing to a slower dynamic. But I also think, Alice, as well, that kind of sentiment side is, I do wonder whether we've got a pool of buyers now sitting on the fence. They're waiting. They are waiting to see and have evidence that the RBA is actually going to cut rates. And I do think that people are waiting. They're waiting for borrowing capacity to increase. They're waiting for that cash rate cut, which we think is going to come sometime in the first part of next year.
Alice, then a question for you off the back of that. Then how does a buyer use this? How do they use this knowledge? If they are one of those ones who are not necessarily just sitting waiting and they are actually kind of ready to go now, how do they use the fact that there are probably more properties there? Those properties are sitting on the market for longer. How do they use that knowledge to improve their position in negotiating a better deal?
I think first and foremost, you need to do a bit of a psychological reset, because this is actually an unusual situation to finally find ourselves in, that buyers have really, there's been a complete dearth of listings over the past few years. So finally, I think it's a bit generous to say it's raining listings, but certain states are certainly seeing that. On the weekend just gone, we had the second busiest day that we've seen all year in Australia. And I do think, though, when you look at also the data around it. So it's really, I think, important to look at what's happening with the time it's taking to sell properties. And as Nicola just mentioned then, Adelaide, Perth and Brisbane are actually selling faster than what they were this time last year. Whereas in states such as Melbourne, Sydney and Hobart, if you're playing on that field, you should really feel the upper hand switching to you, I guess, and use that to your advantage. But pore over those stats so you can actually see those vendors probably sweating a little bit, thinking this is taking longer than what I anticipated to. And I think having that knowledge should actually empower that buyer to feel like they've got the upper hand a little bit, because in reality, if they can't get the deal they want for the price they want or the house they want, they pretty much can feel quite confident they can go around the corner and there might be a similar property on the market or coming onto the market. So that pressure has dissolved.
All right, without jumping ahead then too far, it does feel like now is a better time to be buying. And I feel like I'm now just preempting the end of the show now. It does feel like it's getting towards that. Would you agree with that, Alice?
I do think it is. However, I think, and I say this from a personal perspective, we can all get very carried away with this and think, right, great, go, go, go. However, this is a massive decision buying property, and I don't think that people should be rushing it. So I think it's really important to stay on your own roadmap and really do that research, do that due diligence. So whatever you do purchase is done with caution, but also with a sense of empowerment about what you are doing. And I think it's going to be interesting, though, when we start seeing narrative from the RBA change, what that does to the mindset of sellers, what that does to other buyers. So the advantage is now, I guess one could say, is that there's probably less competition in the market. We know that when the RBA starts to cut rates, that will change the game again. So maybe it's also about understanding what sort of pressures you'd best like to work with, I suppose. Heightened competition or potentially, different prices but a bit less competition.
So Alice Stolz, the voice of reason, it seems,
for once.
Tempering my over-enthusiasm, it would seem. Nicola, can I ask you about units? Because this is really, really interesting, isn't it? What's kind of going on with unit prices. There are records in Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth. And in a couple of key cities, Sydney and Melbourne, price growth is actually accelerating, isn't it?
It is. And overall, what we've seen even on the combined capital city level is the slowdown in price growth is much more pronounced for houses. Says a lot about affordability. And we've got our two, most expensive capital cities, Sydney and Melbourne, have seen a bit of a reacceleration of their unit price growth. I think for Melbourne, it probably showcases the buyer segments. As I mentioned earlier, we have got a rising cohort of first home buyers in Melbourne. They're absolutely going to be steered towards more affordable locations and property types. And an element Sydney too, when you've got a median house price of 1.6, you can understand why, contained borrowing capacities and extreme rates of price growth over the last 4 years is absolutely going to be diverting people towards the more affordable end. And look, this is such a headline. We actually had a bit of a reshuffling on the affordability stakes across our different capital cities. For the first time in 25 years, Brisbane is now the second most expensive city in which to buy a unit. Like that headline, that one line floored me when I saw this unravel. And what that really does show is the strength of Brisbane's housing market overall that we've seen. I mean, it saw a little bit of a downturn, but really not much. And it's just continued to plough ahead.
And Nicola, is it fair to say that investors are kind of like a moth to a flame and they're the ones that are really rushing into that market?
Look, I think so. Investors are definitely sparked by capital growth, and they will go to those areas that they think capital growth prospects are more likely. And when you look at Brisbane with the games and the amount of infrastructure spending, and we know when government spends big on infrastructure, it leaves a legacy in our housing market. You do see a change in price point. So, yeah, investors will be looking towards those areas. And really, if you look at any of our capital cities, the only city I think is going to be in any way able to actually deliver on its infrastructure promise, it's Brisbane, because they've got that ticking, time of the games upcoming, and they need to deliver the infrastructure that has been promised for the games.
I find the whole affordability kind of factor just fascinating, that it is just a straight up reflection of kind of human behavior then, isn't it? That as soon as you are priced out of one suburb or one kind of area, you move to the next. And it's the same kind of looking from houses going, okay, all right, that's unaffordable at this stage. We'll look to the next stage. And so just seeing this playing out in the data is fascinating. Alice, I love talking about strategy. And so this question is kind of then about the strategy for if you are a buyer of an apartment at this stage. Does the acceleration in unit prices change the strategy here? We talked about kind of with houses, you have more time. The property might be on the market for longer. You got a little bit more time, a little bit more freedom, a little bit more room to move. Is that the same then for units, or do you need to be quicker? Do you need to be more decisive, or does the buyer still have a lot of power in this scenario?
I think it depends on what sort of buyer you are. I think if you're an owner-occupier versus an investor, it's probably quite differing situations. But I do think, from the work that comes out of Nicola's team, we really know that it's population growth that is what's really fueling house price growth. So I guess what I'm saying is we know our population is going to continue to grow, particularly certain cities. And I do think when we think of it like that, the sort of dependability of what we're going to see around house prices, they will basically keep going up and up and up. So I'm always reluctant for people to rush in and do urgent transactions based on that. The other thing I think it's worth mentioning here, Michael, is also I think sort of stigma around units is also really shifting. We've got so much conversation at the moment federally and at state and local government levels, particularly in Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane, talking a lot about sort of delivering more apartments. And, in Victoria this week, they actually also talked about incentivising developers who are actually delivering decent apartments. There's a whole other conversation on that one. But this idea around apartments is changing. There's not going to be cookie-cutter apartments in our future, hopefully. We actually are going to get better and more thoughtful about it. And I think opportunistic buyers will really be entertaining the thought about units in a way that perhaps people haven't over the past.
All right, Nicola, final question then to wrap things up. Coming back to where we started, is now the time to buy, or is it kind of looking to the future, looking kind of 6 months ahead, 12 months ahead, waiting to see what happens with the Reserve Bank and just kind of seeing how things play out? I'm asking you for the impossible. Look into the crystal ball here.
Michael, you're going to hate my answer because I really, truly believe that you need to purchase when it's right for you, and it's not about timing the property market. Property needs to be seen as that longer term game, and we need to not be distracted by property price cycles. I think what the house price report allows us to do is it allows us to understand current market dynamics, and it allows people to make informed decisions, and that makes a great decision. So I would say, if you're in some of our cities where we're seeing an increase in supply, we're absolutely seeing that pendulum swing towards buyers, and we're seeing those buying conditions become more favourable. In other capital cities, it still remains very competitive, such as Adelaide, Brisbane and Perth. But I go back to my original answer of it's all about timing when it's right for you.
Oh, it is painfully good advice. Here I was just hoping for this fantastic headline of do it before the end of the week or something along those lines. And instead, no, I get rational, sensible, smart advice based on the data. I should have expected that. Nicola, thank you very much for joining the Property Pendulum today.
Thank you.
That was Dr. Nicola Powell, Domain's Chief of Research and Economics. Alice, final word. I'll let you have this one because it feels like I have tried to kind of stitch you both up today with trying to wedge you on matching my enthusiasm right now. Any kind of last advice for buyers?
Oh, look, I think if you are going out to auctions, I think it's just really important to be incredibly disciplined about your bidding ability. So I think we've talked about this before, Michael, that idea of writing down a price you consider the property at a bargain that you'd think, you've got a really good deal then. Number 2, realistically, what you're prepared to pay and you would pay. Number 3, your absolute ceiling, and that's it. And when it hits that, you have to just think, okay, at least finally now there is other choice on the market. There'll be another one that comes along.
Yeah, well said. Thank you very much, Alice.
Thanks, Michael. That
was real estate expert Alice Stolz, national property editor at Domain, and I'm Michael Thompson. Make sure you're following the podcast, and we'll be back next week with another episode of The Property Pendulum, brought to you by Domain and Fear and Greed, the podcast that tells you which way the property market is going to swing and how to make the most of it.